Hello, uh, welcome to the presentation on myopic short-termism presentism. Uh, I will be updating this presentation every month. Um, Distance has the same effect on the mind as on the eye, so we have the physical eye, which we can see everything around us, and we have the mind's eye, which has its own mind's landscape and its own variation of its own version of depths. Um, the further away something is, the less you can see it. Um, Currently, we're undergoing a crisis of psychological myopia. Um, we are spending all that we earn. We're saving nothing for retirement. Um, we're reading less because books are boring and are too boring, uh, and we're um, uh, plunging into horror films and all sorts of addictions. Um, this is a Nature article describing the crisis of physical myopia, but there's also a crisis of mental myopia, psychological myopia. Um, this is the framework um, that was originally describing um, the the various tiers of first-person shooters, um, but now extended to describe the framework under which the both the distance of the mind's eye and the psychological myopia takes place. Um, when we're consuming beer or a PG-13 movie, uh, it has some elements of horror or high bandwidth that where we become hooked and ensnared by this element. So we go down to the lower tier, which is wine and our movies. And still not satisfied, we go down to another tier, which is whiskey and NC-17. And this goes all the way down. Um, the deeper it goes, the more chance of psychiatric problems. Because the deeper it goes, the deeper we're getting more close to the primordial id. And for first-person shooters, um, um, the how it get how the vortex gets deeper is also influenced by more realism, more senses, more bandwidth, and VR. With VR, we're basically, if you imagine the the screen, the field of view that we have, VR is completely full and is 100% immersion. Uh, Ever more interrelated presentism. These things, I would argue, are interlinked. And uh, one, if you're deep into one part of the uh, problem, you're more prone to another part of the problem. So if you're consuming whiskey, you are more prone to uh, the NC-17 product as well. Uh, and this overall uh, depth level applies to the social fabric as well, because the more one person uh, consumes whiskey and NC-17 uh, movies, that affects the 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 social contagion affects the next person, and so on and so forth. So you can have a a sort of a societal index, if you will, and um, and I would argue that we're plunging um, towards the bottom due to these factors. Um, Due to digitization and increased AR and VR technology, and due to robotization and the end of work, um, physical work is a scarce good that is gradually disappearing, and we were we have run low on a method of healthily sustaining attention. Some hypothetical effects of the entire society and the individual uh, uh, plunging into presentism, increased consumption, increased orientation towards conflict, polarization, and unsubtlety, less patience, uh, unable to read. Some of the more debatable effects are uh, spendthrift, closer to the inn, uh, more self-oriented, and more prone to denialism and and unsubtly weighing the arguments. this, I would argue, the um, part of uh, the effects of the presentism is is the increased production and consumption uh, due to due to presentism, and it's like a never-ending vortex, if you will. Um, Presentism itself is a pleasure, and also any pleasure can lead to presentism. Um, Mitt Romney gave this analogy of a hook that impales a person gradually, that uh, um, that uh, that that you can you're unable to get out of um the downward spiral, because it starts out as um it starts out innocuously, and gradually you are sort of like the frog in the pot, and gradually you cannot jump out of the pot. Uh, so the the intense stuff that gives the most pleasure um, lead to large amounts of psychological problems. Um, and this can be seen that this is in effect a bargain, a Faustian bargain, that where the where you trade uh, prolonging the lifespan at the cost of more blindness. So when you're in a nightclub and there's a higher bandwidth of lights, music, alcohol, and other people, you feel this most strongly. Um, there is a historical precedence for this, and it, the historical precedence, the inflection point of this historical precedence is the uh, conquests of Pompey's conquests in the east, and Caesar's Gallic conquests. It have provide both conquests provided a large influx of laborers who are who displaced a lot of the laborers in Rome. So the Romans, um, so there are two effects by this. One is that how are how is Rome going to deal with this large amount of laborers who are out of work by constructing colosseums and constructing uh, more resource efficient uh, forms of entertainment. And I, I would argue that the more blood or the deeper id that a form of entertainment has, the more satisfying and resource efficient it is. So this was one part, and the other part was um, that that Caesar uh, also enlarged, sort of crossed the other Rubicon, uh, went out of his way to enlarge the Colosseum and provide lavish games to at for the purpose not of resource efficiency but of self-aggrandizement. Um, and this historical precedent has large effects, uh, particularly on the policymakers. Caesar was not interested in gladiatorial combat. He didn't pay much attention to it. He was still of the old guard and held, and much of the uh, senators held the, this form of sport in disdain. But Augustus and Claudius had to be interested in gladiatorial combat. They had to participate and and become more um, um, made it more a part of their lives. So this demonstrates the relationship between uh, social interest in the lower tier stuff and the policymakers. Eventually, it acquires this lower portion of the vortex, uh, the heavy drinking, the violence, acquires a life of its own and ensnares. It is very tantalizing, and and uh, an example of it ensnaring its ensnaring properties is that it it completely consumed Commodus, who was swept away um by by the uh, lower portion of the vortex, swept away by the presentism, and because he, if you measure um the life the lifespan of Commodus by psychological time, he lived longer than almost anybody because he was not only a spectator but a participant, and and that is that is much further down in the vortex. So so instead of measuring our lifespan in years. We can measure it in psychological years. And an average person lives 100 psychological years. Commodus perhaps lived perhaps 1,000 years. Quantifying myopia. It's very easy to misuse this framework. So there are a lot of debates to be had, and one is subtle and intangible, which is how does busyness relate to this framework? We are almost in effect, busyness has become the coin of the realm in terms of how we evaluate ourselves and our self-esteem. The more busy you are, the more self-important that you are, and uh, but it's not severe. It's here, but especially how does busyness impacts the policymakers? It is a tough debate that I think is 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 worth debating, and also particularly this, this there are two issues. One is that the youth are more prone to this whole framework than more mature people. And second is that the youth in effect needs some of this because the youth, this is also an outlet for frustration and for fun. How much of it is too much? How much of it is is too little? And how can we make this less detrimental to the youth and have less psychiatric problems? Make this more psychiatrically healthy to the youth and prevent the youth from being swept away by this thing and dragging the policymakers and the entire society with them. So one of the first steps is to quantify this psychological myopia. If we can measure, and again, this can be easily misused, but is relevant for debating the problem and solving the problem. So some of the measuring tools that we have is is related to the eye. Computerized eye trackers can measure attention clearly, and um, and I think we can uh, we can use the eye tracker and the and it's it's we can use the eye tracker and its response to various media forms. Particularly, we can use the eye tracker for reading, uh, reading words, and and this measures this can this can measure our intrinsic uh, patience tolerance uh, and our position along the id spectrum. Uh, Thank you very much for listening, and um, I will be updating this uh, presentation every month.